I've got my tea. Well, it's hot chocolate, but I'm about to spill the tea. Make yourself a cup of something nice, settle in. We're about to chat. I put up a question box on Instagram and just asked people to let me know if there's anything that they would want to know when it comes to our living in Canada experience versus our living in the United States of America experience. Just bear in mind that we are still babies, we're still infants when it comes to living in the US. We've been to the US a number of times though before we actually ended up moving here. But I used a combination of what I thought I wanted to highlight for people who might want to make the same move, and then the questions that people shared on Instagram, as well as comments that were on a video I had placed or had made on the Clock app, answering someone who had asked why we decided to make the move to this side of the world. If you're not following me on Instagram and you are on Instagram, make sure you follow me on there, because from time to time, if I'm doing a video like this, I will put up a story just to ask if there's any specific thing that you would like to know. So today we're going to be talking about our experience as South African Canadians who lived in Canada and now live in the US. Before we get to that, actually, we do have a new YouTube community name, which is Global Citizens. And this came about through Instagram. Nogu Piwa, who I am 100% certain is going to be watching this video. So hey girl. And thank you for the suggestion of having a community name. But she was watching a video on my channel and she shared a story saying, you know, different podcasts have names for people who watch, for the community that watch the videos on that channel and engage with it. So what is our name? And that led me to taking the name she had suggested and then saying, hey, if this is something you would be interested in us having, let's contribute names, suggest names for the YouTube community, and then we will vote on all of those names, and then whichever one comes up top, that is the name of the community. So Global Citizens is the one that came up top. So hello, Global Citizens. I just want to shout out and say thank you to Nogu Piwa for sharing this idea. We are now the Global Citizens. I understand and know that Global Citizens is an organization already that exists, but as a term, I really liked it because of what a global citizen is when you look at the meaning of that term. And I'll just read here from a quick Google search that I did. But a global citizen is someone who is aware of the world beyond their own borders. One of the characteristics that I absolutely really love about global citizens is that they recognize that they are part of a global community, not just a single nation. As an individual, you can embrace your social responsibility to act for the benefit of all societies. So to act in a way that benefits the collective, the global society, global citizens. So I absolutely love that. And that is the new name for our community. So I do have notes here to help keep me on track. Just as I mentioned, there's a combination of things I wanted to share. Also had a brief conversation with my husband just to say, are there things that I might be missing or that maybe he might have wanted to highlight? And there's a nice analogy that he shared at some point with a question that was asked that I'm gonna talk about. Okay, so from a process perspective, something I wanted to highlight was that the process for moving from Canada to the US was relatively, I'd say, a lot simpler, and it also took a lot less time than the process we went through moving from South Africa to Canada. So if you are somebody who is in Canada, and I think regardless really of which part of the world you might be from, I always encourage, if you want to move anywhere in the world, familiarize yourself with the government's website for that particular country, because that's where you're going to learn about different programs and processes that might exist that might work for you. I do want to highlight that I'm sharing this from our perspective, my move with my family, and I totally understand that people have differing experiences. My experience does not invalidate theirs the same way those people's experiences doesn't invalidate how things have turned out for me. And this is one of those things I said even in that video I made on the Clock app when somebody asked why we made the move, that it's crazy to me how we can be on the internet. There's so many people sharing different experiences about different things, but as soon as your experience doesn't necessarily match up with what someone else is expecting, then you're gonna get comments that are just going left. I really don't like the fact that I feel like I need to say this, but I just want to say this is my experience. These are things we've experienced with my family. Okay, So one of the biggest things that people were asking about were schools. My oldest is in grade 7, so he's in the 7th grade, and my youngest is in the 3rd grade. So similarities are a lot between Canada and the US. In my experience, both the US and Canada, public school is completely free. And I literally underlined the word completely free, and I wanted to stress that because I went through the public schooling system in South Africa. Again, my experience, I totally get that there's different types of public schools in South Africa, same way as there's different types of private schools, but the public schools I went through, both primary and high school, there was a fee that needed to be paid. So both Canada and the US, there's no fee for public school. This might be something that a number of you maybe already know, but both countries, public schools generally don't wear uniform to school. There may be public schools where there is some form of uniform. It just depends on the type of public school, again, that it is, and a number of other factors. But for the most part, or the norm, kids wear the clothes that they would wear if they were at home when they go to school. Buses to school are still free. So they were free in Canada. They're also free in the US. Kids get bused to school and you get placed in a school based on where you live. Both are similar in Canada and in the US. On Instagram, someone asked if buses are free in the US as well. And I thought it was interesting when I just thought about this, that school in a number of places, I even want to say maybe everywhere around the world, kids have to go to school. It's just part of the law. You can't keep your child at home and say, I'm not going to take my child to school for whatever reason. But it is wild if you have a government that will say school is mandatory, but they do not provide any means for those kids who might live in a particular area to go to school. Because as much as there's kids who can walk to school, and we've lived in places where it made sense to walk to school based on the distance that we were to the school, but not every single child is going to be at a distance where they can walk. My kids at this point, for my youngest especially, it makes the least amount of sense. For my oldest, it's not a terrible walk. It's 20 minutes. He's a lot older. I also don't want to be that parent who's like, back in my day, I used to walk for XYZ and then catch public taxis and travel for X amount of time before I made it to school. I don't want to be that parent, but yeah, both of them still take a bus. You have to qualify again, similar to Canada. You have to qualify to take the bus based on how far you live from the actual school. And then somebody wanted to know if lunch was free in the US at school. Lunch is available at the schools that my boys are in. And just from a difference perspective, so I know this also exists in Canada, but the schools my kids were in when we lived in Canada, they did not go to separate schools. So technically, my oldest is in the 7th grade. Next year is the 8th grade. They would have been in the same school up until he was in the 8th grade. Still in the 8th grade. They would have been in the same school. It was combined. But here in the US, from what I saw when we looked at different areas and places, I do think there's a lot more of that division in terms of elementary school, middle school, and then high school. But like I said, I've seen that in Canada as well. And maybe it depends where in Canada you are staying. But the schools my kids went to when we lived in Canada, both in the Greater Toronto area and in the Niagara region, they did not have that. So my kids at this particular point are in separate schools. My youngest is in elementary, which goes from kindergarten all the way to the 5th grade. My oldest is in middle school, which goes from the 6th grade to the 8th grade. So there's only 3 grades in that one school. And then after that is high school all the way to the 12th grade. Now, as I was saying, lunch is available at school. You can pack a lunch. Your child can pack a lunch and take it to school, but you can also pay a very minimal amount. I think it's less than $2.50, if I'm not mistaken, per day for lunch. And it's a very nice menu from the things that I've seen. They'll share a monthly menu for what's going to be on the menu that month. And it's different things, very well balanced as well. But there is lunch, but the lunch is not free. In Canada, the schools that my kids went to, there was no option to purchase lunch at school. They had to take their own lunch to school, but breakfast was available and it was free, similar to here in the US. Breakfast is available and it's free. And I know in public schools, maybe private schools as well, but the public schools I went to in South Africa, there were meals. I think, was it both breakfast and lunch? I'm not sure. But there were meals that were available for kids who were in need. I don't know what the criteria for those kids being able to get those meals were, But what I do like about this particular system is that it doesn't necessarily have to single out any child. Because I do think that, number one, not knowing the process, you may have been someone who would qualify for getting those meals at school, but you just didn't know what the process was. I think the fact that it's just open literally to anyone. If you wanna have breakfast at school, maybe you didn't get a chance to have breakfast at home for whatever reason, you have the option to have it at school. You don't have to register or do something special for you to have that breakfast at school, which I think is very nice in both countries. The thing with Canada though, the schools that they went to, there was always snacks that were available. If your child maybe might not have anything to take to school, there were those snacks that were always available. Fresh fruit, yeah, and a bunch of other snacky stuff that they could eat. Okay, and then from a mentally preparing them perspective. So the first biggest thing is the move itself. That is big and that goes without saying. As I shared with our initial move from South Africa to Canada, is having those open conversations, having those open dialogues. My boys were not the most excited about it, especially my oldest. My youngest, he has had more of that, oh, it's an adventure. We'll see. It's going to be exciting. We'll get to meet new people, will get to just try new things and make new friends. That was the feedback or the enthusiasm that he showed. But my oldest was like, I like my friends. I like my school. I don't want to go anywhere and make new friends and do all of that stuff. He was not happy about it. It was a very tough adjustment, especially the goodbyes. Those were not nice. But also with the friends that he has. And I say has because we've tried to have them keep contact. That's the beauty of technology as well, that you can keep contact with people that you would like to stay in contact with if you can. There's a couple of life lessons here and there that you could put in to help them just understand that change is constant in life. And the more they can embrace it, the easier they can make things for themselves. And it even prepares them for different things that might happen at different stages in life. I went through staying in the same house. I was born in the same house, lived in that same house until I was ready to go to university. I only changed my primary school when I was going to high school because you have to go to a different school for that. But at the same time, in high school, personally, and I know there's people from high school who watch my videos, Bali and hubby, I wanted to leave y'all at some point. Like there was a point in my high school life where I was like, this school is not making sense for me. Like the school is not making sense. And that realization personally came when I realized the reason I picked going to that particular school was no longer valid. So I went to a technical high school. I intentionally chose to go to a technical high school because I thought I wanted to be an engineer when I grew up. I know you don't need to go to a technical high school to become one or be in a STEM field, like that's technical and all that, but I thought the exposure that you would have in a technical high school would be a good one and places you at an advantage over kids who maybe might not have done something like technical drawing maybe when they were in their high school, or mechanics or electricians workshops, electronics. There's so many subjects that we had that I think if you do end up in those fields, it does position you, as much as it's not a requirement to go into those fields, but it positions you in a way that I think is good. And when I was in primary school, that's why I chose that particular high school. And my dad was like, but you have to take 2 taxis to get to the school. You could just go to one that just needs 1 taxi and that's it. And my mom was like, Fox. I wanted to leave that school at some point, but then you think about so many things. I'm like, bruh, I had to like put down a case to convince my parents to take me to the school, taking me to a different school. We wear uniform in the public schools in South Africa. I would have had to change uniform. Now I'm thinking I'm adding extra costs for my parents that are just not necessary. So at some point I wanted to leave that school. And I say this to say, I do think change and being open to it. I wanted to change schools, but it's not something I ever brought up to my parents. And maybe it would have made sense to them when I laid down the reasons for why I wanted to change. Because at that point I was like, I know I don't want to be this engineer person anymore, but I'm here now with all of these types of subjects. I would like to have a lot more exposure, like with subjects, different types of subjects that I never got to experience. So that was a downside of that particular thing. And I think as much as I wanted the change, there was also that element of change comes with so many new different things. And I don't know, like I was just like, it's fine, let's just leave it. And that's how I ended up staying with you guys at our high schools. If I thought about things in a different way, I would have brought it up, and then I very likely would have said, Bye bye. This video is gonna end up being so long. Okay, so from an adjustment perspective, when we actually moved, my third grader adjusted quite easily. We didn't have any challenges with him. But my seventh grader, he took a minute. And one of the biggest things was the number of assignments and how regular they are every single week that they need to complete at a particular time. That is something he was not used to. So a very big difference, and it was something I thought was weird in Canada, was that homework in the schools that my kids went to, both in the Greater Toronto area and in the Niagara region, it didn't seem like it was that big of a thing. I'm like, how is this normal? But there was apparently this whole thing around homework and there not being research that shows that it actually benefits the children's well-being. So there was an article that I read, but there were concerns that were raised about the effectiveness and impact of homework on children's well-being. And so the amount of homework and the type of homework that kids might get in Canada will depend on the school district that they are in, the province that they are in, even individual teachers that they might have. So moving to the US, having that homework, having assignments and due dates, and that level of assignments. I mean, I went to school as well. We had assignments and things that we needed to complete and then hand in at a particular time, but it wasn't at the same frequency and same amount that I see them having to do every single week. This almost reminds me of being in university and having to figure out your schedule in terms of when you are working on assignments, completing those assignments and submitting those assignments on time, so you're not penalized and you're getting the grades that you need to get, and you're studying for tests and you're doing all of the things and figuring out how to sort your schedule and life out so you get into a rhythm and get into a pace where you can keep up with every single module that you have. For them, it's the subjects that they work on. So that took a minute just to get into a rhythm and a flow, because it wasn't something that he was used to, and it's something that I am honestly quite happy to have him experience at this stage in life, because I do think by the time he gets to a point where maybe it's higher education, maybe, I don't know, workplace or whatever the case is, he's going to be a lot more used to it, and it's not going to be something that's brand new that he has to be figuring out. And then another aspect that we wanted to highlight was, in our experience in the schools that our kids were in Canada, the schools that they're in the US have a lot more resources. They're a lot more properly resourced. When we look at the music class, the number of instruments that they'll have in there, the size of the school, when you consider those partitions, elementary, middle school, high school that I mentioned, you look at the size of the school that my seventh grader is in, and I look at all the previous schools that they've been in Canada, where they were both in the same schools, the same elementary schools. Those schools accommodated a lot more grades, but they were a lot smaller, and they also had a lot less resources and things that were available to the kids. Another aspect of things that I do not remember them being in one school that had a swimming pool. Like, we had to, in Canada, pay and have them go to a separate location for swimming classes and all of that, but it was not an option to have it as a sport in school. So here, both of their schools have their own swimming pools. It's just a lot more properly resourced from our experience in the schools that they've been in. Anyway, I just went and warmed up my hot chocolate, so it's actually hot chocolate again. And then we'll move on to the next section, which is healthcare or medical insurance. That's another point that came up quite a bit. So in Canada, basic healthcare is covered by taxpayers, right? So we say it's free for the public, so you don't have to have money to access basic healthcare, but it is funded by taxpayer money. So it's not completely free. If you are somebody who works and pays taxes, you are paying for that basic healthcare. Dental and vision in Canada is not covered. You would need to either pay out of pocket or have dental insurance or vision insurance to be covered for your dental needs as well as your vision. In the US, you need medical insurance. Actually, let me backtrack a bit. So one thing that I always thought before moving to the US was that every single person has to have medical insurance, or else we're just not getting any type of medical help. But since moving here, I've learned that there are programs that are available. I'm just not sure how they work or who qualifies for those programs, but there's programs that are available. And for example, if you have children and you don't have medical insurance and your children need to be immunized for something, there's programs that exist and you can make appointments and state that you don't have that insurance and your child will get the immunization and you won't have to pay anything. So that's something I was not aware was even an option before we moved to the US. There seems to be programs that exist for certain people. I'm just not sure how those work at this point or who they are available for. But sure, you need medical insurance, pay out of pocket or have medical insurance, which if you are from South Africa or you are familiar with medical aid in South Africa, that's essentially very similar to how the medical insurance in the US works. You'll have insurance. If you work for an employer, they may pay a certain percentage of it and you pay a certain percentage of it every single month or every 2 weeks, depending on what your pay schedule looks like. So how often are you getting paid? 2 weeks is the norm here in Canada, here in the US, similar to Canada. So there's that. And then from the perspective of how much the insurance is in comparison, I'll say to South Africa, I'm not the best person to speak about that difference at this point because it's been so long since we lived in South Africa. But there's a number of South Africans who recently moved from South Africa to the US who have shared with me that they find health insurance here in the US a lot more expensive than medical aid in South Africa. So that's the common, I'd say, consensus feedback or however you want to put it. But that's what people who have recently moved from South Africa to the US have shared. If you are someone who has recently moved and you have something to weigh in about the health insurance cost, then please feel free to do so in the comments because it might help someone that might be wondering about the same thing. And then one of the things I wanted to highlight from a lived in Canada experience is that in the 6 years that we lived in Canada, we are still technically on wait list, because I guess if we get to the top of the list, we would get a call, I'm assuming, saying, hey, you're at the top of the list for getting a primary care physician for your family. So we've been on wait lists since we moved to Canada. Now, I do want to also highlight that when we moved from the Greater Toronto area, which is an area we lived in for over 3 years, and we moved to the Niagara region, we didn't really make that much of an effort to try and find a primary care physician. So I just want to highlight that and say maybe people who are in smaller towns might have an easier pathway to getting a primary care physician. We just didn't try as hard. I think the first couple of, no, we're not taking new patients, we were just like, we'll just carry on using the walk-in clinic services that we were using when we lived in the Greater Toronto area, because we are technically, as far as we are aware, still on those waiting lists and we haven't gotten a primary care physician at this point. We use a combination of walk-in clinics and the emergency department at the hospitals, whatever was the closest hospital to where we were, based on whatever was going on. And I've also shared those experiences on various platforms where it's either one of my kids has had to go a couple of times, I think twice if I'm not mistaken, to the emergency room, and then I had an issue with my hand not very long ago and I was in the emergency room in the Niagara region. At this point, we weren't in the Greater Toronto area, and we waited, I think it was between 9 and 12 hours, I can't even remember how long it was, and I ended up just leaving. But I had hurt my wrist, my fingers were getting swollen, 2 fingers were swollen when we got to the hospital, and you wait, you don't know at what point you're gonna be getting called, you don't know what number you are on the list, you just have no idea what's going on, and you just sit there waiting in hopes that someone eventually will, I guess, get to you. So yes, Canada has the basic health insurance, but when you need to use it, it's a problem. And again, this is our experience. Totally get that other people have different kinds of experiences. In the US, after we settled, like in finding a place and we moved in, I called in the second week of that taking place, like us just having a place and being settled in that place. I called to try and find us primary care. I looked at different places, reviews and all of that stuff, and then we got a place, we got a primary care physician immediately, essentially. Like, we got appointments to go in and do our initial check-ups, like that annual checkup that we weren't really doing when we lived in Canada, because we're lucky enough to be a relatively healthy family that we don't need to frequent visiting the doctor and all of that stuff. So we got that done. I wanted appointments at the time for all of us in the same day if it was possible, and we had appointments the following week. Accessibility is great. And then from a perspective of paying for insurance, in Canada, like I said, you are already paying for your dental and your vision. So adding full medical insurance when you move to the US, again, this depends on which part of the US you are moving to, how much the taxes in that state are, and a bunch of other factors that will contribute to how much you end up getting in your pocket at the end of every 2-week cycle when you get paid. But you end up with a lot more in your pocket in the US than you do in Canada. So when you have to pay for insurance, it doesn't feel as though you're taking money out of your pocket just because you've crossed the border and you now live on this side of it. You get more money in your pocket, which makes making that medical insurance payment make sense. And again, depending on various factors, you could still be seeing more in your pocket even after paying for that medical insurance. I remember the last time I went to see a doctor in Canada, I had a rash like that was just all over my body. It was the summertime. I went on Google, like I will go to Google, and I'm always saying don't diagnose yourself with things, but I went to Google just to look up what I was feeling from a symptoms perspective, looking at pictures of people with similar rash to what I saw on my own skin, and I was like, okay, it looks like I have a heat rash. And then I got this ointment over the counter that was supposed to help with it, but I took a picture because it wasn't getting better, and I think it was just maybe a day or something of me using that cream that I purchased. I decided I'm gonna go to a walk-in clinic. I sat there, waited for I think it was like 3 hours, and then finally got to see the doctor. And the doctor went to Google, Sham. He went to Google and he was like, oh yeah, look, this looks like this, so yeah, that's likely what you got. And this cream that you say you have, like that's a very good cream that you got for this particular thing that I'm seeing here on Google. So yeah, you can just carry on using that cream, and if it doesn't go away in, I can't even remember, maybe say in a week or something, then you can come back and we can look at something different that could help. And at that particular point, I thought to myself, well, the doctor was quite young. And I don't have anything against young doctors, but at that particular moment, I'm like, maybe even if you do use Google to check a bunch of stuff, I don't know, maybe do it like, look like you're doing something serious there on your computer while you are looking at it. I don't even know, guys, but it did not give me that confidence in going to see someone and they doing the exact thing that I just did for myself. You went to med school for years to use Google in the same way that I'm using Google. We're a relatively healthy family. We haven't had a lot of experiences with having to go to see a doctor or have a need for a doctor. But those moments, those little times here and there that I've shared on different platforms over the years where we have needed to see a doctor, I don't know, like it's just one of those things where I'm like, if there would be something very serious that would need you to constantly see a doctor, how would that work? I'm not sure. I don't particularly feel very confident in the system being able to support me in the way that I would need it to support me or my family at this point. So here in the US, it's been accessible. And one question that somebody else had was, do we not have a fear, or do we think rather that our claims are not going to get denied in the US? Because you see it all over social media, in the news, that people's claims get denied. And that's one of those things where we can only plan and really with what we have done to try and prep for whatever worst case scenario could happen. I have no control over what claims would get processed and what claims would get denied. For the little that we've used it so far, we haven't had any problem with claims being denied. But I also do think this is not something that is unique to the US. There's a number of people in South Africa who have had their medical aid claims denied for reasons that seem very crazy for whatever situation they might be going through at the time. So I have no control over that. What we have done is what we can do, what is in our control in terms of trying to get coverage as best as we can for what our needs might be. When you think about how we are humans, and as humans we go through things naturally that are going to need some form of care, but we also have to have this added stress of, am I going to be able to afford having a medical something happen? And based on where you live in the world, Your answer may be yes, I have no fear, I will be sorted. Your answer may be I will get into debt over this. You may be someone who has a fear of not having access to that healthcare, maybe if you would need it the most, or whatever. Being a human is a lot. A support group at this point for humaning would be amazing and great, because the things we have to think about and essentially stress about, just like, bruh. Okay, so let's move on to housing. One thing that is similar to Canada, that is very important if you're looking for a place here. They do look at your credit score, your references, and it's quite important. One of the things that I found, and I don't know if they do it in Canada, but maybe it's just not something that is explicitly shared in this way, because when we were looking for places in Canada, I don't remember it being a background check from that. We're looking at your criminal history and record, if you're a registered offender for something, because every single adult has to get that background check done in the US. And maybe it's similar in Canada, but maybe it was just not as in your face as it felt like it was on this side with different places. And then depending on the type of place that you would be looking to rent, you may find landlords that are fine and understand that if you are coming and moving from a different country, you're not very likely going to have the credit score because you're still new. You haven't built up your credit score, and they can work with you in different ways where you can show that you are good for the money and you would be able to pay for your rent. But a number of places that work with rentals, that's just the business that they do, they may be a lot less lenient towards the credit score side of things. But again, if you are someone who may have things that you can show to say, I am good for this money or this rent, to be able to pay this rent, then you can work with them. But yeah, credit scores are quite important, which makes it very tricky if you are someone who is moving from a different part of the world and you haven't yet figured out or worked with your credit score in that particular country. And then somebody else wanted to know about, let me finish the housing side of things. Okay, housing in Canada, in the US, before we even moved to the US, I used to share comparisons of the US and Canada from a Niagara Falls US perspective, which is in New York State, and a Niagara Falls Canada perspective, which is in Ontario, because they're right next to each other across the border. So I would share videos of places that are in Canada and Niagara Falls, how much they cost, how big the place is, all of that good stuff, and then try and find the most comparable that I could find from a square footage perspective and a bunch of other things, just to say, this is Niagara Falls on the Canadian side, this is Niagara Falls on the US side, these are the differences. And they were quite huge. So I used to share that a lot, but again, it will depend which part of the US you're in, which part of Canada you are looking at, but you are more likely going to find places in the US that have a lot more affordable housing costs than Canada. Because it's crazy to me when I used to share this and people are like, oh yeah, just move away from Ontario, what are you doing in Ontario? Of course it's going to be more expensive. Because people would say move away from Toronto, and I'm like, that's exactly what we did. We moved away from the greater Toronto area to the Niagara region. And now when you're like, I'm not in Toronto, I'm like an hour away from Toronto at this point. It's actually over an hour, I think. But anyway, then people would be like, move away from Ontario. What are you doing in Ontario? You're going to find cheaper places if you go to, and then they will name whatever other province that they think might be cheaper. And from an opportunities perspective, you're also moving away from a lot of places. There's people that I know who moved to Canada, to certain parts of Canada, like Alberta, for example, that have had to leave Alberta because they couldn't find work, they couldn't find opportunities, and they had to move to a bigger place like Vancouver, or making it all the way to the east and move to Toronto just to have access to a lot of the opportunities that are not available in some of these other places that may be a lot cheaper when it comes to the cost of living, including housing costs. But in the US, depending again on where you look, where you are, there are towns, there are places where you can find places for very nice prices. Similar with Salaries, Glassdoor is a platform that I've shared a lot, and I still do highly recommend. Go on Glassdoor, make a comparison, and you will find that a lot of times people doing the same role in Canada versus the US, the one in the US is going to be getting paid a lot more than the one who is in Canada. I think another thing that is important to highlight on that particular part of things is the fact that the US is a much larger market. And then an example that I wanted to share from a housing perspective and the differences between Canada and the US, when we were about about to purchase a house, when we were going to buy a house in Canada, we stayed in an apartment for a couple of months. I think it was 3 months maybe. And the cost of that apartment was more than the townhouse that we are in the US. And this was in the Niagara region. So we had moved away from the greater Toronto area and we were looking for our house. So that's that from an example perspective. But again, I encourage you to go and look at things for yourself. So how did we move? What visa are we on? We moved through the L1 visa. So for the people who wanted to know the pathway to a green card, I don't have a green card story to share. We moved through the L1 visa. There's a number of different options that exist that you could potentially move through. And the L1, L2 visa is a work visa. So there's different options, and I do encourage that you look at the government's website. And then somebody asked, will the decision to live in the US change in the near future? So will our decision to live in the US change in the near future? So something I have highlighted before on the channel, people would ask this even when we moved to Canada, like, are we planning on moving somewhere else? And my answer was always, I really don't know. If I come to you next month and I'm like, oh, we are now living in this particular place, home for me is where my family is. So wherever I am with my family, that is amazing. That is home. When it comes to living in a particular place, at this point, we are people who are very much open to exploring and experiencing different ways of life and of living. Something that I've spoken about quite a bit is how, as people, we've made it very normal to pick and choose and try out different things when it comes to certain things in our lives, like clothes. If maybe you're looking for a new coat, you know you want it to be black, but you're not quite sure of the style, you're going to try on different coats, you're going to go to different stores, you're going to, you'll do a couple of things. Even when you're searching for a car, you're going to try out different places, you'll look at different brands, you'll maybe even test drive different cars until you find the one that you're like, oh, this is actually the one that I would like because it ticks all these boxes that I have. And then based on whatever I've seen and experienced, this is the one that I would like to choose. But when it comes to the environment that we live in, the space that we exist in majority of our time, the physical place that we live in, we are not as open to doing that. There's something that seems like, oh my gosh, like why would you go live here and then live there and then, but this is such a huge part of your life that shapes so many things about your life. Your physical environment can shape so much, even about the mental environment that you end up being in. The mental space that you are in is heavily influenced by the environment that you are physically in. And I don't think we have gotten to a point where it's normal to just come shopping around for a place that I may like the most, because visiting a place and living in a place can be very two different experiences. And I also do understand and acknowledge that not everyone has that privilege or that access to try and live in different places, but there are people who do have that access, but they're not really doing anything with it as much as they may want to. But you will spend more time looking for a cup than you do when it comes to deciding on where you actually live. It's something I feel like I would love to see change. Like, I'm not actively saying that's what I'm trying to do or whatever. I'm just experiencing things the way that I would like to at this point, and I'm very grateful for the access to certain opportunities and places that we've had over the years. Short answer to will the decision change in the future? I have no idea. And that is one of the things that also makes it so exciting. It makes it very, very exciting for me. And somebody asked if there are more opportunities in tech in the US for Canadians. So I mentioned a bit earlier that the US is a much larger market, so it does mean there are a lot more opportunities that would be available. Yes, there may be a lot more competition as well, because there will be a lot more people in the US, or there are a lot more people in the US than there are in Canada, but that larger market makes there be more access to opportunities than you would have in Canada specifically. Now, I do not know, and I'm not aware of opportunities in the US that are specifically for Canadians, but I think just as a market in general, and regardless of what space you are in, whether you are in tech or you're in a different industry, the US is a larger market. So you are going to have more opportunities in the US than in Canada. And the biggest thing that you could do to set yourself apart from all the other people who might be looking for the same opportunities that you are looking for is just working on yourself as a brand and putting yourself out there, allowing yourself to be discoverable. And LinkedIn is one of those platforms that I talk about a lot, and I will continue to talk about it because I do think it's still a very large opportunity to find or be found for certain opportunities. I do have a LinkedIn guide that I created that could help you optimize your own LinkedIn profile, and I'll add that in the description of this video so you can grab it from there if you would like to give yourself an opportunity to be discoverable and found by companies that might be looking for someone who has your skills and your experience, regardless of where you are in the world. Because there's companies that may be open to sponsoring and offering you relocation if you do have the right skills that they are looking for. And then somebody else posed, I don't know, it was more of a statement in my opinion as a question, because they just wrote pew pew violence, but they used the actual word of a pew pew. We haven't experienced it. You've seen it in the news, you've seen it in the media, and I've seen it in the news and seen it in the media in the same way that you have. One of the things I thought to bring up and mention when I saw this, I'll say a statement really, because it wasn't a question, is that there's a point, it was either in 2016 or 2017, where we were visiting the US and we were in Vegas, we were in Las Vegas. And the hotel that we stayed in a couple of months after we were in the US, there was a pew pew incident that took place, and there's a number of people who lost their lives in that incident. And it was just scary to look at and be like, wow, we were at the exact same hotel that this person who started this pew pew incident and ended up hurting and taking the lives of a number of people, they were in the same hotel. But this is now months after we had left. But had it been a couple of months before that they decided to go and do that, we would have been in the same place. And it was just a very scary thing to think about. But things happen in different parts of the world at this point. All we can do is our best really with keeping ourselves as safe as we can, but things happen in so many different places. But we don't have any experience at this point with the pew pew violence. And then another question, or a number of questions, were on friendships and loneliness. And similar to Canada, I will say if you are moving to a different place, you have to put in an effort and be intentional in making those friendships and forming those relationships with other people, so you are not ending up in a place where maybe you're experiencing that loneliness. I was fortunate enough to move with my family to North America. I have lived in Europe though, where I moved by myself, and during that time I didn't experience any loneliness because I had connections with people that I was working with at the time. So I met a number of people, and I also had those connections with my family back home and friends. So I never went through a point where I felt lonely while living abroad. I did create a video though where I went through specific tips that could potentially help you mentally prepare if that's something you are thinking about doing, but you are worried about the loneliness side of things, because you will have to be a lot more intentional about your relationships and how you are putting yourself out there so you get to meet and get to know different people. So I have linked that video to this one, and I'll add it to the description as well. Okay. And then from a travel logistics perspective, moving between Canada and the US, this was another question that came up, but we booked a U-Haul. All of our moves within Canada have been through U-Haul, and you can cross the border using their service without a problem. You pick a pickup location for the truck that you want to use, and you can hire a truck based on the size of your move. So if you're moving from a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom apartment or house, you can book a truck that is gonna be a size that fits what you are looking for. So you choose your pickup location, you choose your drop-off location, and you can be picking up in Canada and you drop that car off in the US. It works pretty fine. You don't have any problems crossing the border with it. Just when you are crossing the border, one thing to keep in mind when you are packing is that you can only pack things and move with things that are legal for you to cross the border with. So as an example, in Ontario, Canada, cannabis is legal, and it's also legal in New York State. So you're using that maybe Peace Bridge or the Rainbow Bridge that's in Niagara Falls to cross. Cannabis is technically legal in both countries, in that province and that state that are connecting, that you would be joining through, but it is not legal at the border. So don't cross with things that are not legal for you to cross with. So check the site just to make sure that you are not packing things and trying to move with things that you technically shouldn't be moving with. But yeah, it's not a problem. You declare the things that you are moving with at the border and you shouldn't have a problem. We still have our house in Canada, so we weren't packing up the entire house, and we purchased some furniture when we moved to the US. And then somebody else asked, would you recommend Canada or the US for a family of 4 looking looking for job opportunities? The short answer to this one is that it depends. It depends on a number of variables and what you are looking for as a family. And as much as I understand that the job opportunity side of things is a very big one, but there is a lot more to the living and the life side of things, right? Having an income is definitely a very big and top aspect of the move. And like I mentioned previously, the US is a much larger market. It has a larger market than Canada. So you are going to have access to a lot more opportunities on the US side than you would in Canada. The analogy that I mentioned at the beginning of the video that Tammy shared was, if you have a small pond, and in this case we're saying Canada is the small pond since it's a smaller market. You have a small pond and there's 10 people fishing. There's fish in that pond and there's 10 people fishing in that pond. And you have a much larger pond, but in this pond now you have 20 people fishing. You're like, oh, there's a lot more people that are fishing here. There's fish in this pond as well, but there's a lot more people who are fishing on this side. And the more fish that are in that pond, the larger that fish, and the more fish that are in that pond, even if there are more people who are also fishing to try get the same fish, you have a higher chance of getting a fish yourself if you are in a space that is a lot larger, a lot more open, even if there's a lot more people, because there's a lot more spaces that you could find yourself in where it's maybe not covered by the people that are coming to fish. And maybe I didn't put like Tammy's analogy, in the most perfect way as he did when he was talking through this, but essentially what he was saying was there are a lot more opportunities in the US. Yes, there will be a lot more competition because it's a bigger market with a lot more people, but you stand a better chance of getting yourself a fish in a bigger market than in the smaller one. So if you are looking specifically for job opportunities, then you may be in a better spot if you are looking at a larger market, which the US is a lot bigger than Canada. And then the last thing that I want to touch on that came up on the Clock app was, what is my take with everything that is happening with Trump and all the changes that are happening in the US? And the short of it for me is, we cannot be mad, or I cannot be mad, and I am not mad at a country saying we have systems, we have laws, and we want people to come into our country abiding by those laws and those systems. So if they are saying they do not want people who legally should not be here, I cannot be mad at that. I do not see anything wrong with looking at things in that way, that come to our country, but do it the right way. So we know that you are here and this is what you are here for, and you are following the processes and the systems that we have in place, because we are living in a world that has systems and has laws in place. So that's the short of it for me. And if they would wake up one day and say, we don't need or want your skills in our country anymore, can't be mad at that. I'm someone who has spoken about borders in Africa specifically and how they do not make sense. And Trump at some point, he's spoken about the border and he called it an artificial border between Canada and the US, where he's like, we should just get rid of this thing. But at this particular point, my short of it is, we cannot, I cannot, and I am not mad at people wanting law and order in a space, because there can be a lot of chaos that can come if there's rules and there's laws that are not being followed. That was a mouthful. I think my hot chocolate is not hot anymore. It's definitely gone cold again, but my name is Busi. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I will see you on the next video.
Thank you for watching.
Cold chocolate it's not so bad. Okay.